Now I'm going to talk about multiple and double stops, and I'm going to talk about what to listen for and also how to make them more comfortable. The very first thing to do, if you've got a piece that has any note that agrees with your open strings, check it, right? So you don't just go and say, oh, that's a good G. You go, that's okay. That's not good. Once you find it, try to give yourself clues or even physical cues of where you're touching. I call this the secret touch. Can you see my index finger is slightly touching, not gripping, just slightly resting against the nub here. And from that, I can do like, you can find your own set of whole steps and half steps that you like. But for me, I love whole steps much more than half steps. So I usually do that. And then I can catch the octaves first time, right? Same thing with fourth fingers are good, or if you want to learn. These are all notes that ring with the open strings, and we should be able to find them in our sleep. And there are all sorts of cues that your violin can give you and that your hand can give you if you pay attention, so that you can repeat those exact positionings. George Nykrug called this muscle memory, and he said it's the most important thing when you're practicing. Once you know where something is, you memorize what it feels like. Not what it looks like, what it feels like. The next thing that I want to say about double stops is you always want to know who's the most important. So when you're playing a Bach fugue, do you want the bottom note to come out or the top note to come out? This is where your alignment can really help you. If I'm playing a third, let's say I'm playing a third, and I want the bottom note to come out, I can do several things. One is I can slightly angle the bow. Can you hear the D more than the F sharp? And you could see just a tiny angle in my bow. If I do this, now my bow is closer to the bridge on the E string. You can hear the F sharp better. So this is really good when you have one of those conversations in a Bach fugue, right? The other thing that will help is if you vibrate the melody note. And sometimes I say this to my students at Boston University, and I admit I'm making a little joke because, of course, if you're trying to vibrate the melody, your whole hand is going to move. So you're not going to just vibrate the melody. But if I'm thinking more vibrato on the F sharp, what that does is it makes the balance for that first finger, which is playing the F sharp, more deep in the string, deeper in the string. And then you hear that note. Now I'm going to tell my third finger to vibrate more. You can hear the difference, right? So you can do this all the way through anything that has double stops, as long as you know which line you want to bring out. This really comes into play in Bach fugues because you might have a big difficult chord, something that immediately comes to mind is this is all our favorite bar in the A minor fugue. Remember this, guys? Okay, that's over. So I want this note. That's the melody I want. You might say, okay, this is easy. I can easily bring out the G sharp. This next chord, everybody thinks about the top, and then they basically don't have a bass. They just, and I don't know what the bass is. I've got to hear the bass. So I balance for the bass notes. You can see where my elbow is. Then I do something I call wrapping. So did you see? My elbow moves under the violin because that will give me a good sound on the F. If I stay like this, my elbow is not in alignment for this note, and my melody is lost forever, or at least for that one note. If I balance entirely to the top note, you won't hear the bass line. So when you're practicing your fugue or anything else, you've always got to be aware of your principal note and how to make it balance. And moving the elbow, depending on what string you're on, is very helpful. It's also really useful to practice in a Bach fugue or anything, just the upper line with your right hand, but both notes with your left hand. So then I'm gonna do, and you could tell I didn't get in balance. That's not a good sound. So here, and perhaps you could see a little bit the small adjustments I was making with my elbow. So that's a very good way to make sure your voice always comes out in a fugue. Next, I want to talk about the feeling of the fingers as you're playing double stops and multiple stops. My teacher, George Nykrug, would tell me it should feel like you're cutting into a juicy steak. I'm not quite sure what he meant, but I know that when I want to play fast, I play on the fingertips. But when I want to play double stops, I play more on the pad. Now, probably you've heard this, and maybe you tried to go more on the pad by doing this. Problem with this is, this makes a very diffuse sound. You don't hear the center of the pitch as well. So there is an alternative to get more pad on the string. I call this the footy. If you see pictures of Jascha Heifetz's left hand, he had very tapered fingertips, and he had a ginormous sound. There's a picture of Jascha's left hand in Samuel Applebaum's series, The Way They Play, and you can see that his left hand fingertip does not just taper down to a small tip. It actually has a little extra pad that comes out almost like a little tiny foot at the end of his fingertip. And that is how he could play with a really big, luscious sound, because he has that little, what I call footy. So you want to develop your footies by sliding your finger like 1/4 or 1/8 step just to where that first joint almost collapses. If you do it to where it collapses, that's not good. That's not a good sound. So I'm getting rid of the square. Now, what you might notice as you're trying this is that your thumb will relax and that the finger itself feels easier on the string. This is going to make it much easier for your fingers to work back and forth between the different double stops, because excess pressure is a real killer when you're playing double stops and you're pressing with 2 or more fingers. You can just turn your entire left hand into a vice. So keeping these fingertips plush, relaxed, comfortable, and slidey. So they must easily slide. So again, with this relaxed first joint, I can easily slide, and I can even slither between strings rather than just picking up and moving them over. When I'm playing a Bach fugue, I can borrow the techniques from Baroque, where you release each stroke. So rather than sustain, which would require a little bit more sustained pressure in the left hand, I can release. And just doing this one thing to your Bach fugue will make a huge difference when you have chords. If you keep this pressing down, first of all, your left hand will get really tight and it'll be hard to make the next chord. But it also reduces ring. If I release to the top of the string with my left hand in the same way that I release my bow, there's more ring. And my left hand is happy. So I have to really deliberately practice releasing to the top of the string so I don't bear down all the time. Never press more than absolutely necessary. The main voice, as we've discovered, could have a little bit more pressure than the accompanying voice. As a general rule, if I'm playing in the lower positions, I will pronate my fingers. But there is an exception to this. When I have a half step, I will angle my fingers slightly differently because I have very fat fingertips. If you have tiny fingertips, you may not need to do this, but I actually have pretty bulbous fingertips, and therefore playing a half step can make my hand very tight. So I will demonstrate a good way and a bad way to play a half step. So here is a very expressive half step. Now, I want you to notice three things. First, that was a very expressive C sharp, very close to the D. Second, if you look here, I am not squeezing together. And now if you look here, you will see that my fingernails are actually facing different directions. So the rule for half steps is that your fingers have to be angled differently, the two fingers that are making the half step. So if I'm doing 1, 2, 3, can you see which finger is angled? The second finger is angled. I usually like to angle the bottom finger of a half step, okay? And then I can, it's even closer now. This does not make my hand tight. If your hand is frequently getting tight when you've got very chromatic music, you should check this out because you might be trying to play. I'm going to demonstrate it without angling. First of all, that's not a very good half step. Second of all, it doesn't sound good because the left hand is not in balance. And thirdly, can you see the squeezing? And I don't know if you can see, but the thumb is also squeezing. So this fingertip placement, the angling of the fingertips, turns out to be tremendously important for those of us with fat fingers. And this is why Isaac Perlman can play incredibly close half steps, even though I think his fingertips are possibly as wide as my thighs. He really has lusciously fat fingers. The good side of this is that you have usually a better sound when you have those nice fat fingertips. So don't be too hard on yourself, but you do have to learn to make these tiny half steps. Okay, so of course in a scale, going fast, that's really important, but it turns out that there are a lot of double stops that are actually half steps, okay? So one of them is a tritone. So, right? So if your tritone is often not sounding good and you don't know why, okay, so I did not angle. The lower finger is the B. I'm going to put him on the inner left corner. Then the second finger is going pretty much in the middle. And now that's a good sounding tritone, okay? What's the other interval that's a half step? Minor 6. So here, again, if I put them in exactly the same part of the fingertip, which is hard for me to do you notice how that sounds a little dead? Okay, and it's a little too wide for what I often want. That's a little narrower major 6, and it also has more ring. So this is a very important thing for these double stops. Next, I want to talk about easy versus difficult. That is the way that D.C. Dunas classed them. So easy intervals are the ones that are a fifth or higher. Even by this definition, even ninths and tenths are easy. Difficult ones are ones that are smaller than a fifth. So that would include tritones, fourths, thirds, major and minor, seconds, and unisons. My teacher in my master's degree at Yale, Oskar Shumsky, had us practice scales in unisons. It was really distressing because you never really knew which finger was out of tune. It took you a while to figure that out. So the reason that Dunas called these difficult double stops is because it's not quite as relaxing as playing the easy double stops. If you think about a chord like this. Feature of every violin concerto, right? That is made up of major six, all of them wider than a fifth, all of them easy double stops. So it's one of the most fun things that you can do on the violin is to play a chord like that. Or how about this one? Very happy minor sixth, okay? In the 20th century, you get composers like Bartók and Schoenberg who are very fond of using fourths. Fourths are perfect, and they are also using Dunis's term difficult. So there is a way to make them slightly easier. I wanted to show you this because, of course, they are in the fugues. When you do an easy double stop, you can allow the point where your index is almost contacting the side of the neck to be a little lower. And what does that do to your elbow? Put your elbow a little bit under the violin, and then your hand is in balance, okay? You might notice that my wrist is straight. There's a line from my wrist to the elbow. If I am playing something and I forget to do this, I bet you can tell the difference in the sound, even through this recorded medium, okay? So I'm a little more underneath the violin for the easy double stops. And this is true here. And of course, my elbow adjusts for the string, but you can see I'm not raising this particular contact point. For the difficult double stops, you want to have this contact point a little higher. So, and also you put the lower finger first. So if I'm going to play F sharp, C sharp, I'm going to first put down the first finger. I'm going to make sure I'm not too low. I'm not under the violin, but I'm actually up just a little bit. My elbow is a little bit more forward. And then after I have the first finger, I put the second finger down. So that's a fourth that's in balance. So I'm going to go back and forth. Right? They both have to ring. Now, if I try to do this without the little tiny movement of my elbow and my contact point, let's see if I can do it. Can you hear how dead that is? And it's also not as comfortable because I'm working to get the fingers to have a natural balance. So the lowest finger goes down first. In a difficult double stop, the elbow will be slightly more forward and the index contact point will be slightly higher. This makes a big difference in passages like in Paganini, when you have thirds. Thirds are in the difficult class of double stops. So therefore your elbow needs to be forward. But octaves are in the easy class. So therefore your elbow needs to be under the violin and your contact point a little bit lower. Try it and let me know. So some of the exercises that I like to use, of course, if you're new to double stops, I highly recommend the Polo double stop book because it starts out very easily and then progresses rapidly. If you've been doing some double stops, like for example, in your scale practice and you're a little bored with your flesh double stops, there is a Kurganov exercise, which I use, and I actually have a slightly easier version and a slightly harder version. I also use Sevcik, Opus 1, Part 4. He goes through so many keys so fast. It's very, very pleasurable to practice those exercises. And of course, no double stop study is complete without the Isai preludes. He wrote 10 preludes, one for each interval. So you can spend an entire week playing his etude based on seconds. It's pretty amazing stuff. So that's 10 preludes, Opus 35. In the future, I'm hoping to be able to do tutorials on these exercises. And if you'd like to see one in particular, please write that in the comments section so that I know that you're interested. One of my favorite exercises involves perfect fourths. Fourths, unlike thirds and sixths, are non-negotiable. Either they are in tune or they are not, and you can really hear the reverberations. They are also part of that class of difficult double stops that Dunas talks about. So the name of my exercise is May the Fourths Be With You. Fourths. And it's simple. You just alternate open strings with fourths. Now, what you might notice is that I'm playing loud, right? So that I can hear the overtones, and I am listening to see if they're out of tune. If you play very floaty, yeah, that's in tune. Actually, it's not if you play in the string. So you have to play with a good, full, strong tone. And I would recommend repeating when I'm picking up the fingers. They keep talking to each other in the air. They are not just going away and, I don't know, going to lie on the beach somewhere. They remain in communication, in radio communication. And because they are still talking to each other, they can go right down to the same place over and over again. So I'm keeping this space very palpable between my fingers. I'm not letting that space disappear when I pick up my fingers. I am keeping that space. Now I'm keeping it between second and third. Now between third and fourth. Ideally, I should be able to hit this fourth over and over again, because it happens here before it happens on the string. So that's what you want to be able to do, right? You want your intonation to be repeatable. You can play all the fourths that you want in first, second, third position. And then once you're very solid about doing 3/4 is usually the hardest for most people. Then you can start doing whole hand things. So things that you find a lot in Izai. So I don't know if you can hear that overtone, but I'm really listening. There's a buzz when you get it right. You will no longer need any drugs whatsoever because you've got the buzz from your double stops. So those are the two kinds of exercises that I like in May the Fourths Be With You.